The Humanities Graduate Center. I'm Eric Warby. I'm the director here. And we're about to begin two rather remarkable days talking about a remarkable figure in 20th century intellectual and political thought and activism, and that is C.L.R. James, Cyril Lionel Richard Robert Cyril Lionel Robert James. We'll hear a lot about him, so I won't say more about James himself, but I do want to introduce the two speakers. Before I do that, I just want to say thank you to Philip Menon and Isabel Hoffmeyer, the Center for India's
Indian Studies in
Africa, CISA, and to the Reading Group for African Critical Thought. Sinelis Bangas here are the other two here, Gudai and Kota and Nicole. The program for the 2 days is that we are first going to hear a lecture by Aaron Kamugisha, who comes from the University of the West Indies at Cave Hill in Barbados. Keith Hart is going to be responding and getting the conversation going, and then we'll just have an open discussion. Tomorrow, at the same time, we're going to have a lecture by Keith Hart, and Aaron is going to be the respondent. And in between, at 11 a.m. in this room, for those of you who are enthusiastic enough, you can join us for a reading group discussion where we'll consider some of James's writings. And if you haven't done so, you can just contact people at the front desk and they will email those writings to you so you can have a look at them in the course of the evening. But you're welcome to just sit in and learn about James in that context as well tomorrow. Let me say a bit about Aaron Kamugisha. He's a lecturer in cultural studies at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus in Barbados. He completed his PhD in social and political thought at York University in Toronto and was the 2007-2008 postdoctoral fellow in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. His current work is a study of coloniality, cultural citizenship, and freedom in the contemporary Anglophone Caribbean, mediated through the social and political thought of C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter. He is the editor of a special issue of Race and Class, Caribbean Trajectories 200 Years On, and is also published in the Journal of Caribbean History, Proud Flesh, Small Acts, and the Philosophical Forum. His forthcoming edited collections include Caribbean Political Thought, The Colonial State to Caribbean Internationalisms, Caribbean Political Thought, Theories of the Post-Colonial State, and Caribbean Cultural Thought from Plantation to Diaspora, all which will be published by Randall Press in the coming year. So that's a lot forthcoming from Aaron. Aaron is going to speak on C.L.R. James's New Society and Caribbean Freedom. He'll speak for about an hour, and then, as I say, Keith Hart will get us started. I'll just say a few words about Keith Hart. I've known Keith now for about 30 years, where he was a friend and mentor to me as a young master's student at McGill University. He's taught at a dozen universities around the world. He was once director of the African Studies Center at Cambridge, and his work has ranged from close ethnographic and historical and regional studies of West African economy, informal and formal migration and labor, to really the core work of the last couple of decades, which has been about money. He is currently helping to steer a very exciting new initiative at the University of Victoria, which is called the Human Economy Initiative, where there are not only a group of exciting young postdoctoral fellows, but also a new cohort of doctoral students who have joined. Keith's reason for being here are many, but one of them is that he spent a couple of years in the late 1980s as helping to give shape to an initiative in social thought at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And I think it was during that time that he worked directly with C.L.R. James and was responsible, together with Anna Brinshaw, for editing and helping to bring to light James's unpublished manuscript, American Civilization. But more generally because the work of James has been central to his thought about the black world in history. So I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to give his lecture, and then we'll hear some comments from Keith, and then the floor will be open to any of you who want to ask questions or make comments. Thanks, Aaron.
Yes, well, let me start by thanking a number of people here, particularly Eric, Dilip Menon, Isabel Hoffmeyer, for their hospitality in inviting me to do this lecture here at WITS. I'm actually in South Africa for the first time. I am here partly as part of a project that Isabel is editing called 10 Books That Changed the British Empire. And it's really been an extraordinary week so far. And so again, let me start with thanks to everyone for arranging this initiative. I should also perhaps add, in the way of a bit of an apology, due to, are you hearing me at the back, by the way? Kind of not?
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of, okay, all right,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. Yes, as a result of the change in temperatures between the quite hot summer Barbados and then London and then here and Cape Town over the weekend, I'm not fully at 100% in terms of my voice and stuff, so I'll struggle through, but I may have to take sips of this tea, etc. from time to time, okay? So just bear with me slightly. I originally was going to begin with a preamble about my work and how CLR James figures into it. But I'll just put a couple of things on the table because we could come to that and discuss that further in question time. And the paper that I have to present is relatively lengthy. So my work is largely on the social and political thought of the Caribbean and the African diaspora. And within that extraordinarily large area of thought and of work, I'm very concerned with the Caribbean post-colonial society and state, the impact of neoliberalism and the transformation of identities, subjectivities, and citizenship that's come as a result of that. But also the question of the profound nature of the ideas that have emanated from the Caribbean intellectual tradition over the last century, and the ways in which those ideas can be used to enchant a new vision of post-colonial citizenship within the Caribbean. At least that's a larger take that I've been making in my work through a number of articles. In this work then, I've been particularly drawn to the work of CLR James and Sylvia Winter. And James, my interest in James will become clearer in this paper. And what I'd like to do from here is actually start with two quotes, or two framing quotes, to get us underway on this paper on CLR James, the New Society and Caribbean Freedom. And the first is from an interview that James did in 1980. And the second is from the introduction, well, actually the appendix to his Black Jacobins. And so I'll start with the paper. With a life spanning the century, and at various times a collaborator and mentor to activist intellectuals from George Padmore to Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael to George Lamming, Paul Robeson to Alice Walker, Leon Trotsky to Walter Rodney, for 6 decades, CLR James was one of the quintessential radical figures of the Pan-African world. Assessing the legacy of the figure many consider to be the outstanding Anglophone Caribbean intellectual of the 20th century is of course a very heady task, as there are not just many interpretations of his work, but his corpus of work is often very rarely thought of in its entirety. And one way I would suggest to start will be to examine his perspective on his contribution to radical thought and human freedom. And in an interview conducted in 1980-81, which I quote above, James was asked the simple question, what do you think your greatest contribution has been? And this is James at 80 years old now, because he was born in 1901, it's 1980. They're asking James, what do you think is your greatest contribution? And he says as follows, my contributions have been, number 1, to clarify and extend the heritage of Marx and Lenin, and number 2, to explain and expand the idea of what constitutes the new society. And in my talk this evening, I'm somewhat more interested in exploring James's second proposal about his contributions, though this is hardly to suggest that his propositions are opposed. In fact, they are quite dependent on each other, which we'll discuss further. And here James's phraseology is quite important and worth closer examination. He states that his second contribution, as we see, is to explain and expand the idea of what constitutes a new society. Now, James very frequently spoke in superlatives, so referred to a number of writers as the best writer he had ever read, and the most astonishing purpose he had ever encountered. But this phrase, the new society, or alternatively, the concept of the new in society, particularly captivated him, and is a term that you see frequently in his writings from the 1950s into the 1960s. In his 1958 text, for example, Facing Reality, the new is identified with the new nations emerging from colonialism, reflected later in his statement in the appendix to the second edition of the Black Jacobins, which I also have here. To be welcomed into the comity of nations, a new nation must bring something new. Otherwise, it is a mere administrative convenience or necessity. The West Indians have brought something new. Now, at the risk of sounding pedantic, one of the questions that ideas of the new always raises is what constitutes the old, or how and why this break with the old is actually taking place. The new suggests a daring rupture with the old, but this hardly guarantees that the terms within this break or culture are actually progressive, as its gesture is primarily concerned with the articulation of a new discursive practice in the zone of representation. So attempts to mobilize the idea of the new, like Alan Locke's New Negro, for example, or even Stuart Hall's New Ethnicities, often find themselves vulnerable to critiques that call for a more careful periodization of their claims about the new forms of life that they suggest are in the process of emerging. So in the case of Locke, for example, legitimate questions have been raised by generations of scholars about the conservatism that clearly shows its face in its definition of a new Negro and its association with a general elision of black radicalism from the popularly told story of the Harlem Renaissance. Stuart Hall, while not prey to the kind of conservatism that haunts Locke's work, suggests that points to the new ethnicities that he sees as emerging are, and I quote, the effect of a theoretical encounter between black cultural politics and the discourses of a Eurocentric, largely white critical cultural theory, end quote. Now, though Hall is very clear that in theorizing the new, he is not advocating a substitution of one kind of politics for another, or suggesting that the struggle over old identities have disappeared, he somewhat seems to make the complexity of black representations and identities in British society dependent on theoretical formulations within the academy. Stuart Hall's reflections on the new, then, strike me less as an adequate demarcation of the space occupied by old and new identities, but more productively, of course, as a series of speculations on how we might think our identities are new. And one could claim that that's what he's trying to do, but there is this problem in terms of the way that Hall sometimes articulates this. Now, their discourses of the new, in the daring of their challenge to the old, often in one form or the other rest on discourses of tradition and modernity. And James's work is actually in many ways no different in this regard. And in the 60s, we see a struggle by James on the cusp of Anglophone Caribbean independence to try to create a strategy in a number of these speeches that he gives that merges ideas of tradition, modernity, old, new, and Western, non-Western into clear, compelling statements. And we see him talking then about the Caribbean as a new people, a people unique in the modern world, occupying a new nation, and whose writers are involved in the production of a new Caribbean history. And I'll give you one example of the way that all of these things coalesce in certain statements James will make in his speeches at this time. And if you look at this 1964 essay from called Party Politics and Economics in the Caribbean, and I'll read it. The Caribbean territories have a universal significance far beyond their size and social weight. They seem to be a slice of Western civilization put under a microscope for the scientific investigation of the fundamental predicates and perspectives of that civilization itself. Owing to the expatriate character of the whole Caribbean, all of the old problems seem posed anew in terms which are easily grasped. New in that they are not dominated as in the older countries by long-established growths and accretions. Urgent in that the Caribbean problems demand some settlement, if not solution. comprehensive and very modern in that politics, economics, and sociology are one indivisible unit. And so here we're seeing that the problem of a new society for James in his post-1950 work is largely intent on clarifying what exactly is the relationship between this thing called new society and Caribbean realities. The Caribbean is part of the West for James, but the absence of long-held traditions in it means that it's a very different, intensely modern space within the West. Writing in the epilogue to the 1969 reissue of History of Negro Revolt, James would say the following about the Caribbean, and I'll quote, "Whereas the economy continues to be a colonialist economy, the population is a modern population, a population of the 20th century, learned in the languages and techniques of Western civilization, and highly developed because of the smallness of the islands and the close relationship between areas technically known as urban and rural." End quote. The Caribbean nation for James then is, without the slightest trace of a contradiction, a completely colonial colony and a completely modern population. And there's a lot more to say about James's travels and battles with this space called tradition modernity, because in many ways, James, not dissimilar to some other Caribbean thinkers, actually inhabits a certain conceit about the Caribbean and its space within the Western sphere. He thinks the Caribbean is more ready for a particular type of revolution simply because it is more modern, and the modernity in the end has to do with its contact with European languages and European civilization. And we can talk about that more in the discussion period, because it's a remarkable aspect of what is, in general, of course, a very radical and very profound figure. But what I want to do is lay aside for the moment that set of speculations with which I've begun about James and the Caribbean and tradition modernity, and go more to the heart of my paper and another set of questions on the new society. And this has to do with the question of gender and relations of gender, which James sees as essential for the full actualization of this new society. And James is very clear here in the last few decades of his life that human freedom has to be twinned to the liberation of woman. And it's a funny one because it's a fragmentary topic that disappears and appears across his various texts. So there's no one James text on women or on women's liberation. However, if we read between the texts and through the text, we can get something on his legacy. And I'm going to attempt to do this. I've been doing some work on James and gender, and I'm published on James and gender. And I want to actually start in a relatively peculiar place, perhaps. And that is actually with James's perhaps best known work, at least within the Commonwealth, and that's Beyond the Boundary, his classic book on cricket. And there's one particular quote from Beyond the Boundary, ostensibly about the cricket quote, that I wish to start with as a pathway into thinking about James and gender. And that is this quote from Beyond the Boundary. And I'll read. In an article welcoming the West Indies team of 1957, E.W. Swanton has written in the Daily Telegraph that in the West Indies, a cricket ethic has shaped not only the cricketers, but social life as a whole. It is an understatement. There is a whole generation of us, and perhaps two generations, who have been formed by it, not only in social attitudes, but in our most intimate personal lives. In fact, they're more than anywhere else. The social attitudes we could to some degree alter if we wished. For the inner self, the die was cast. But that is not my theme except incidentally. The coming West Indian novelist will show the clash between the native temperament and environment and this doctrine from a stern clime. Now James's extraordinary comment, ostensibly about the cricket code, is a point at which I would argue we can begin a discussion of the fascinating ambivalences about gender and sexuality that arise in this work. The sphere of intimacy is raised by James as a site of the deepest penetration of a public school code, but immediately on acknowledging this, he draws back from its implications, suggesting that West Indian novelists will be the ones to fully explore this terrain. This retreat itself is ironic for a couple of reasons. First, James's reflections on cricket culture are a critical resource for anybody interested in thinking about the relationship between coloniality, masculinity, and reproduction of certain forms of gender relations in the Caribbean. These texts reveal not an easily identifiable Caribbean masculinity with an instrumental relationship to sports which simply confirms its prowess, but compelling revelations about male homosocial bonding, the complexities and ambivalences of colonial masculinities, and the yearning for a particular productivity of performance of the male body, both on the field of play, but in the wider Caribbean society. But secondly also, there is throughout James's text a worry about women and their relationship to the new society that he wished to usher into being. And a reading of James's critical work on women and gender relations would actually include a whole volume of, could be a whole volume of itself. I mean, you could range from the short stories that he has in the 1930s, at the very beginning of his career as a literary artist, the letters that he sends from London in the early 1930s, his American years, and particularly his letters to Constance Webb, one of which I'll cite and quote, and a number of texts that he wrote in the late 70s and the 1980s on the woman question, which I will speak to a little later. But particularly very late in James's life, in the last decade of his life, and I'm thinking that Keith Hart will be able to help us on this. In a series of articles and interviews, James constantly expresses disillusionment with his past personal experiences with women, the blame for which he placed squarely at his door. The nature and extent of ruminations on gender in James's work take on greater importance when we consider how rare reflections of this kind are by Black Caribbean men of his generation. It points us just towards not just a greater understanding of the coloniality of gender relations in the Caribbean, but also contains hints for those of us who are interested in speculating about the place of Caribbean men in Caribbean feminist criticism. But there also is a more compelling reason, perhaps, for considering James's efforts to think about women's struggles in gender relations. The very last decade of James's life coincided with the fall of the Grenada Revolution in 1983, an event which, as George Lamming has told us, traumatized the left, and we have not yet quite recovered the meaning of that event. It is perhaps not too much to say that one of the most decisive changes in the intellectual culture of the Caribbean region since that time has been the outpouring of an incredible array of multidisciplinary, genre-defying activism and work on and behalf of women, their lives, and Caribbean gender relations. So really, Caribbean feminism emerges in this particular 30 years. And the fact that this work, of course, has produced its own backlash is relatively obvious. Most of us will be familiar with the kind of backlashes that took place towards feminist scholarship in the 70s and the 80s. And one of the things that this has actually made very clear is the sheer intransigence in some ways of sexist culture in the region, which was actually very well expressed once Riley by Patricia Muhammad, a major Caribbean feminist, when she said that Caribbean patriarchy is not willing to be a tacit partner in its own deconstruction. Okay? Most patriarchies aren't. But there are also quite a number of questions, though, that we might very well raise about the work that is actually now being produced in Caribbean masculinities. And one of them is a question of, what is the study of masculinity and Caribbean masculinities for? Is it explicitly guided by a feminist ethics? And what futures does it hope to imagine? Beyond discourses about hegemonic masculinities, with illuminating but somewhat tightly scripted mappings of a Caribbean male colonization of Black female subjectivity, and those types of phrases, what different perspectives can emerge for examining the interpolation of patriarchy into all of our lives in the Caribbean? What can C.L.R. James say, and his struggle to theorize the transformations in gender relations that he saw over the course of his life, tell us about the reception of feminism in the minds of Caribbean men? And that's at the heart of what I'm trying to do in terms of thinking about James and gender. Now, what I'd like to do from here is move to a moment in 1976, and specifically here, James's essay towards the 7th Pan-African Congress, Past, Present, and Future. Because James was never completely unaware of the ways in which women are narratively written out of foundational stories of the nation. And his struggle to rethink the premises that resulted in his own illusion of women's agency and participation in the nation is one of his most compelling attempts to actually usher in this thing called a new society. And this particular speech, the 76th Pan-African Congress speech, or rather the critique of the 1976 Pan-African Congress, is actually one of the best places to go to understand this. Now, like most radicals, James was faced with a problem posed by the 6th Pan-African Congress, which not only was hijacked by post-independence governmental elites in Africa and the Caribbean, but for James left no particular doctrine behind it. So for him, in many ways, even though he was very important in terms of the drafting of the initial call for it, he thought the 6th Pan-African Congress had been failing. And in this speech, this essay, in which he gives a statement about the program the 7th Pan-African Congress will need to follow, James called for the end to the deification of a national state in Africa. He indicted the new African elites, and he insisted that revolutionaries' primary concern must be with the masses, which of course is a statement as relevant for our times as it was at the time in which he was writing in 1976. But nearing the conclusion of the speech, he actually turns to George Lamming, the Caribbean writer's last novel, Natives of My Person, which was published in 1972, and the particular treatment that George Lamming gives of women in Natives of My Person. Okay? And he has the following to say about the primacy of gender in the liberation struggle to come. And he says this: today, Lamming says, today women represent something, are something. They are a future that men must know something about. In other words, what he is saying here, he meaning Lamming, what he is saying here is what he has been saying in all his books, that men constitute an elite in relation to women, and women have got a capacity which men have got to learn. A capacity which men have got to learn. Now, the African-American activist and scholar Jerry Augusto, who was very important in the drafting of the call for Six-Pack, has recollected in one of her talks having lunch with James the very day that he finished reading this book, Natives of My Person. And Augusto was there having lunch with James. And James said to her, okay, what do you think of the final page of Lamming's Natives of My Person? And it's a very compelling and interesting end to the novel, because Lamming has one of the female characters who's reflecting on her husband's behavior, say the following line: "We are a future that they must learn." And Jerry says to James, well, I don't know, what do you think? You're CLR, James, what do you think about the line? And James looked at her and he said, I believe that what Lamming is saying is that women are the last revolution. Okay? And of course, immediately here, the multiple meanings of last should come into our mind. Last is in latest, last is in final, last is in lingering. So I believe this is a memorable turn of phrase by James, but to understand it fully, we need to appreciate James's longer view of women's agency in the new society. And the funny thing, of course, here about considering a figure like James is that we cannot discount the kind of romanticism, the ambiguities, and the very obvious paternalism in many of these formulations that James is making. Because Selma James, for example, James's last wife, in her speech, very interesting and very long and very radical and controversial speech, at the CLR James Centenary Conference in 2001 in Trinidad, said that when she actually read the last line of Lamming's book, We Are a Future That They Must Learn, she said her heart sank when she read it. And she said that for her, women are disempowered by Lamming's line because they have to wait for men to understand them. And of course, as we know, men take a very inordinate length of time to understand things that they don't want to understand. And James has a complicated relationship to this novel, which I'm going to return to again at the end. But I should make it clear that the reading that I'm doing of James is not dependent on positioning James as uniquely insightful. I'm not saying that he is a male feminist, or I'm not even saying that he is resolutely pro-feminist. Actually, what I find more interesting is the fact that there are all these contradictions, there's all this despair, there's all this worry in James around women, around feminism. There's a way in which he will retreat and he will recoil from certain feminist understandings, while on the other hand, he'll be making some extremely insightful comments towards them. So what I'm going to do from here now is I'm going to read James on gender from about 1940 through to the 1980s. I'm going to focus at the end on his unpublished autobiography, which is called, or a section of his unpublished autobiography, which is called My Experiences with Sex and Woman. But I'm also going to lift certain passages from his 1944 letter to Constance Webb, his text, American Civilization, and a number of texts in between, and contextualize them and go from there. So in a letter to in 1944 to his future wife Constance Webb, James has the following to say about women and American economy. This one I don't have that. With the increasing opportunities that modern production gives to women, a new type of woman arises. She is called a career woman. The name is stupid, but nevertheless very revealing. A man is never a career man. That is his right and privilege. He can have his career, and the finest fruit of his successful career is wife and children. But a woman is called career woman because